And those of you who have signed on to work for the Daily or who are contemplating careers in journalism may be wondering, what the hell am I getting myself into? I'm hoping I can ease your fears today, at least a little. Within the last year, it seems to me, there's been a palpable shift in the national conversation about newspapers. For most of my 40 years in this business, and especially for the 25 years I've spent at the New York Times, the loudest voices were always the angriest voices. To those out there on the ferocious right, we were Bolsheviks and heathens. To those out on the left, we were warmongers and corporate stooges. Liberals have tended to criticize us with a kind of earnest disappointment. Conservatives tend to do so with gleeful outrage. In 2007, when we cut the size of the Times to save money on newsprint, the joke that went around the conservative blogosphere was 1.5 inches down, 12 inches to go. Especially in recent years, as a clamorous new species of critic has been enabled by the miracle of the internet, we've become the favorite chew toy of various hyperventilating advocates, conspiracy theorists, and snarkoleptics. And of course, for the utopians of the web, we are the loathed mainstream media, dinosaur monopolies just waiting for the meteor strike to render us extinct. I'm the first to admit that some of this disappointment has been justified. Newspapers are written and edited by humans. We can be smug, we can be tone deaf. We certainly get things wrong. The history of our craft is tarnished down the centuries by episodes of partisanship and gullibility and blind ignorance on the part of major news organizations. My own paper managed to pretty much overlook the Holocaust as it was happening. But it's also true that you know about our shortcomings in large part because we tell you about them. It's part of our creed that we try to own up to our mistakes, from the petty to the egregious, and fix them. For connoisseurs of penitence, the Times correction column is an endless source of entertainment. On a good day, you run across something like this, quote, "The personal health column on December 2nd about detecting and treating esophageal cancer misstated the size of the gastrointestinal endoscope, the instrument used in the traditional screening test for the disease. It is usually 9 millimeters in diameter, about 1/3 of an inch, not, quote, the diameter of a garden hose." Or there's this one, which Greg Brock, who handles our corrections, offers as his all-time favorite. It comes from the paper of October 2000. Quote, "An article in the Times Magazine last Sunday about Ivana Trump and her spending habits misstated the number of bras she buys. It is 2 dozen black, 2 dozen beige, and 2 dozen white, not 2,000 of each." And there's no statute of limitations on contrition. Last month, we published a correction of an article about the engraving inside Abraham Lincoln's watch. The original article appeared in 1906. At the other end of the culpability scale, I've had a few occasions to write mea culpas for my paper after we let down our readers in more important ways, including for some reporting before the war in Iraq that should have dug deeper and been more skeptical about Iraq's purported weapons of mass destruction. It's not fun to take yourself to the woodshed, but it is essential to our credibility, and it's not something that all institutions do. Come to think of it, we're still waiting for the Bush administration's mea culpa on those weapons of mass destruction. There are still voices out there clamoring for our demise. I have one regular correspondent who emails me every time our stock price goes down, which is almost every week, to remind me how much he looks forward to dancing on our grave. The messages usually begin with the salutation, "Bill, you treasonous prick." But while the vitriol has not dried up entirely, more often these days we hear from people who want to come to our rescue. The critics have begun to contemplate what a country without the New York Times might actually be like. Publications that in better times see it as part of their mission to tweak the mighty Times, places like New York Magazine and Vanity Fair and the New York Observer and the Columbia Journalism Review, have begun commending us for the dazzling inventiveness of our website, or for the courage and stamina of our Baghdad Bureau, or for our prescient coverage of the current economic crisis. In the New Republic a couple of weeks ago, Paul Starr of Princeton's Woodrow Wilson Center worried that the decline of newspapers would bring a corresponding decline of democracy. More than any other medium, he wrote, newspapers have been our eyes on the state, our check on private abuses, our civic alarm systems. It is true that they have often failed to perform these functions as well as they should have done, but whether they can perform them at all is now in doubt. Some of us have recently taken turns fielding questions from Times readers online in a feature we call Talk to the Newsroom, and we've been surprised that by far the most popular subject these days is not bias or anonymous sources or the Middle East, but the fate of our own business. Readers have implored us to find a way to charge for our content on the web. Some asked if they could send us money. I wonder if the executives at General Motors get mail like that. Saving the New York Times now ranks up there with saving Darfur as a high-minded cause. Walter Isaacson, the editor, author, and think tank guru, commanded the cover of Time magazine with a call for newspapers to begin charging their web users. Steve Brill, the publisher and entrepreneur, has produced an elaborate proposal for reinventing the newspaper business model. Recently, a couple of financial officers from Yale proposed on my paper's op-ed page that civic-minded philanthropists establish a New York Times endowment to sustain us into the future. They estimated that about $5 billion would do it. A writer in The Nation magazine has proposed a government bailout and a system of tax subsidies to keep newspapers alive. I don't honestly expect that the survival of my newspaper or most other newspapers lies in the hands of kindly philanthropists or the U.S. Congress, but I welcome the constructive attention. It makes a nice change from being called a treasonous prick. I've been invited here to muse a bit about the recent past and the unnerving future of our business. Editors, as you know, are responsible for the contents of the Times, not its business model. This is the only business I can think of where the people who make the product have traditionally been kept apart from the people who sell the product. That's to protect journalists from the undue influence of advertisers and perhaps to protect sober company executives from the corrupting influence of journalists. For most of my life, that division of labor has been fine with me. My job and my joy is telling other people's stories. And at the moment, it's a wonderful time to be in the news business if you don't think too much about the news business. But like everyone else who labors in journalism or who just loves it, I worry about our future. I discuss it constantly with colleagues, and I cringe at the amount of really bad journalism that has been produced on the subject of the future of journalism. Throughout the tumult of the past few years, I've been a calculated optimist about newspapers. My faith has been severely tested, but I still believe that newspapers in some form will survive and flourish, and that my own newspaper will be one of those left standing after the deluge. For years, I based my faith on the simple law of supply and demand. There is a diminishing supply of quality journalism and a growing demand, and in economics, that usually means there is money to be made. By quality journalism, I mean the kind that involves experienced reporters going places, bearing witness, digging into records, developing sources, checking and double-checking, backed by editors who try to enforce high standards. I mean journalism that, however imperfect, labors hard to be trustworthy and fair, to supply you with the information you need to be an informed and engaged citizen. The supply of this kind of journalism is declining because it is hard, expensive, sometimes dangerous work. The traditional practitioners of this craft, mainly newspapers, have been downsizing, dumbing down, or declaring bankruptcy. It's tempting to blame the internet, and I'll get around to that. But much of what is happening to newspapers is the continuation of a long trend. When I left the staff of the Oregonian in 1979, Portland had 2 daily newspapers. 3 years later, the Newhouse chain closed the afternoon paper, the Oregon Journal. When I left the staff of the Dallas Times-Herald in 1984, it was one of 2 good newspapers jostling for primacy in that city. In 1991, the Belo Corporation, the owner of the rival Dallas Morning News, bought the Times-Herald for $55 million and shut it down the next day. The fact is, newspapers are extremely expensive to start up and sustain because of the costly infrastructure, so there is a natural tendency towards monopoly. It's no surprise that the cities that have had newspapers die off or scale back in recent months, Denver, Seattle, Detroit, and others, have been 2 newspaper cities where the papers have been kept barely alive by joint operating agreements. Their demise is sad, but it's been a long time coming. Also not particularly new is the fact that proprietors of the only newspaper in town, once they have a monopoly, feel